The nation has been celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 1918 representation of the People's Act today, and with it, women getting the vote for the first time. But actually, that's not quite the case. A few women did have the vote in local elections decades before that, and a very few had been voting even before the Reform Act of 1832 as well. Those were some property-owning women. But for many more women to vote in national elections is obviously a big thing, which is why today is marked as the real birthday of women's suffrage. And if you were watching yesterday, we devoted half our programme to that milestone. However, it's not escaped the notice of some that February the 6th, 1918, also marked the day that many working-class men, the non-householders, got the vote too. A fact far less prominent in today's festivities. For some, this is a metaphor for identity politics in the current era. We're so preoccupied by some traditionally defined underprivileged groups based on colour, gender or sexuality, we forget just how many white straight men have been or are, or at least feel, underprivileged as well. Has class got lost? We'll discuss in a minute, but here's John Sweeney.
100 years ago today, women over 30 who owned property got the vote, and working class men too. Since then, some working class men might be forgiven for thinking things have got better for women than for them. Take politics. To begin with, working class men got a Prime Minister first, Ramsay MacDonald in 1924. James Callaghan and John Major followed suit. Women have Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May. There's little prospect of a working class hero in number 10. Neither Jeremy Corbyn nor Vince Cable are horny-handed sons of toil. Still less Jacob Rees-Mogg. Back in 1918, most people were working class. Free state education helped catapult millions out of poverty and ignorance. Today, only 4 in 10 are working class. But what is striking is how the privately educated rich, less than 1 in 10 of the population, still do so much better than the working class. Has the liberal elite's growing focus on race, gender and sexuality left working class people overlooked in favour of identity politics? And did this neglect help propel Brexit and Donald Trump?
It's an interesting question. John Sweeney there. Well, Claire Fox is the director of the Academy of Ideas. Faiza Shaheen is from the Centre for Labour and Social Studies. They both say they're working from the working classes. I'll come to them in a moment, but a bit perversely, I want to start with a US perspective, because in New York is the political scientist and author Mark Liller, who wrote a much-discussed piece after the Trump election victory, arguing that Hillary Clinton and American liberals have put too great a focus on identity politics around gender, race or sexuality. Due to the success of that article, he's expanded the argument into a new book, The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics. It's out in this country in May. Very good evening to you, Professor Liller. And do you want to just explain why you think that the kind of identity politics thread of liberal American politics had gone too far?
Well, I think the shift has really been from a politics of interests, and there can be interests of particular groups, I mean concrete interests. The vote is one such interest, economic gains, the end of Jim Crow in the American South. But a politics of interest has been substituted in this country by a politics of recognition. And the politics of recognition is about being recognized as a member of a group, not only the group being recognized, but that individuals, particular individuals, feel recognized and, as we say in this country, affirmed in their identities. And the shift from interests to identity and to recognition has meant that it's been harder to build bridges among various groups who share common interests or have overlapping interests. And so when you have a politics of interest, the interests of the working class, the interests of women together, then you can build a coalition.
Right.
But when it's a politics of representing yourself and feeling recognized, that tends to divide people rather than bring them together.
Let me just pin you down a bit, though, because I mean, we've all seen, I don't know how many videos of American police shooting black people over the last couple of years. Black Lives Matter is a result of that. It's a classic piece of identity politics. What can you say against that? I mean, what would be wrong with campaigning for American police not to shoot at black people or kill them?
Well, I wouldn't call it identity politics in the way that I mean it, or rather there are elements there in the Black Lives Matter movement that are concerned mainly about recognition. If you're concerned about actually changing concrete conditions that have led to this terrible situation of what we call driving while black and having problems with the police, then you have to think about how you govern. The only way to change that is by winning elections and governing over the long term. Now, a politics that focuses on interests and shared interests and overlapping interests can achieve that. But a politics of recognition tends to fall into symbolic gestures. So, for example, Black Lives Matter didn't only work to change things on the streets of many of our cities. Activists also showed up at the rallies of Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and tried to stop the proceedings in order to get recognition of their movement and their own conception of American history. And so a politics of recognition can divide people over what it means to be recognized, what the nature of our history has been. Now, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were the allies of these people.
And there were a lot of arguments.
They should have been...
Mark Lilla, I wanted to go.
Supporting them.
I want to take what you've said and I want to put it to my other guests. So look, thank you very much indeed for setting that out. Faiza, do you recognise any of that Mark Lilla critique of the way identity politics can divide, as applied to the UK and what we've had here?
Look, yes and no. What I'm suspicious of an argument that says that groups coming out that have legitimate grievances shouldn't talk about them because otherwise it hurts people from winning elections and it divides groups. What I would say is that different equality groups, we haven't always been good at connecting it to broader issues in the economy. We're not very good at recognising that this is also an economic issue.
But they're not all economic issues, are they? I mean, the fight for equality for LGBT communities, I mean, there are a million things. They're not.
Sure, there's an element of discrimination and prejudice that we have to address. Yeah. But also, if you look at, say, feminism and what's happened in terms of the economy, we've seen that traditional women's work is lower paid. Like, why is it that social care is so low paid? And I think we need to be doing much more to understand that connection with the capitalist system. So, you know, the idea isn't to equalise misery. We're not, the aim isn't to say, you know, my job isn't done when I say that, you know, white working class men are as affected by austerity as brown women. My job is done when austerity ends. And so that is the difference that I would say.
Okay. Claire Fox, do you think the identity politics has gone too far in this country among certain categories?
Yeah, I mean, I think identity politics has been wholly divisive. I'm very sympathetic to Mark Lilla's writings, which I've read. And here I think that what it's led to is a kind of jockeying for position of recognition and actually a competition to play the victim. I'm actually concerned that when we talk about class in this, that what we end up doing is then saying, what about white working class men? They're an identity too. And I think that to a certain extent that's happened a little bit in America with Trump. And you can see that is the only place to go. You know, I too am a victim who is suffering and oppressed. But I think that class is not to be ignored. I mean, I've been bemused today in relation to the vote, that in fact the celebration was of women getting the vote, and all hail the celebrations. Big thing, no problem. But I couldn't get over the fact that the kind of millions of working class men who got the vote.
Because the male suffrage almost did double.
But it really, but it was really kind of like not hardly mentioned at all in terms of that. And I thought that was an interesting thing. And I think that we can see in that jockeying for position, by the way, that was what has happened, and, you know, intersectionality and all of these different things, is that there is a real sense in which there is a real snobbery in relation to a lot of working class things. I think Brexit's brought that to the fore in many ways.
Do you at least recognise there might have been a tactical mistake? If you go on about minorities and women too much, then you create a backlash among a group who feel they haven't been recognised.
I mean, that
and
just makes...
that's what Mark Liller thinks happened in the US. I mean, you know, a lot of people just felt you've shouted out for every other group and you haven't shouted out for me, so obviously you're not my friend.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird to argue to silence groups that, again, have legitimate grievances. You can't say to black men, you should be quiet. No, but this is kind of where this argument goes. And what I want to say is that I think there is a real thing about class identity. You know, it really annoys me that every time we hear working class these days, we hear white in front of it. Working class is multi-ethnic, it's women, it's you know, it's men, and we should build solidarity. But look, if we were arguing here that class is really important and that we should go back to class identities, we would also be arguing for the trade union movement. But
I think Claire, last word.
Yeah, I do not think that the point is whether you're white working class. The point is because of the emphasis on identity and the fact that people stress ethnicity, stress gender, LGBT thing. What we've got is kind of campus politics writ large on society, intersectionality and people jockeying for their identities. And there are certain groups that get left out of that. And the white working class have undoubtedly fared badly in that kind of...
Because they don't tick any of the other boxes.
Well, look, you know...
But it's not that I want them to become the white working class. And I agree with you, but what is wrong with politics is it's got to be organised around ideas, not identities. And then people take sides politically.
We should so continue this discussion for another half hour, but look, we have to stop there. Mark Liller, Claire Shaheen, Faiza, thanks very much. Well, talking of identity...